and welcome to the Thought Room. I am your host, Hallie Rose, and on this week's episode of the podcast, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Kyle Bowler, who is the co-founder of an organization called Psychedelics Today. Psychedelics Today is an educational platform, and it's also a weekly podcast that explores the science and culture of the emerging psychedelics field. Kyle has degrees in transpersonal psychology and also clinical mental health counseling. In addition, he has studied so many neat areas from non-ordinary states of consciousness to shamanism, Reiki, plant medicine, holotropic breathwork, you name it. Kyle is also a fantastic storyteller. I don't want to give away too much. In fact, I don't really need to, because just 1 or 2 minutes into this interview, you will probably be just as enraptured with Kyle as I was. His interview is rich. It's full of juicy tales that had my jaw on the floor and also had me laughing in stitches. We get to dive into some of the nuances of what's going on right now and the trends in what could be called the psychedelic renaissance. We talk a little bit about the research and how things are looking as a society, and do we fully understand the power of these substances, and do we have the proper structures in place to support what we're seeing in the trends. After listening, I have a feeling you are going to be interested in learning more about Kyle and the programs he is putting on. And on that note, if you're looking to take your own psychedelic education to the next level, Kyle has made a super generous offer, which is he has offered a 15% discount for Thought Room podcast listeners for his course entitled Navigating Psychedelics, Lessons on Self-Care and Integration, and that is offered through Psychedelics Today. I will put the direct link to that course portal in the show notes, and all you have to do is click that link and type in the code ThoughtRoomPod, and that will give you 15% off of that course. Not only that, but every person that purchases this course through that portal and using that link, Kyle has offered to give a small donation back to the Thought Room podcast. So it's a win-win. You can learn something about an area of interest if this is fascinating for you. And you can also, in addition, support the Thought Room. Speaking of support, I want to thank Robert B. This episode was funded entirely by the listener support of Robert. Thank you so much. I, as you may or may not know, like to do all of my interviews for the Thought Room in person. I am really firm on that because I believe that there's a magic that occurs when two people get in the same room and they can lock eyes and they can really hear each other. That's when the heart gets to connect. That's when the most fantastic and wild stories and sharing occurs. So that's a beautiful thing. But it also means that sometimes I have to travel to meet these guests in person. And because of that, there are often travel costs associated with this podcast. In addition, I laugh sometimes about what I didn't know before starting this podcast. And one of those things was the sheer cost of just maintaining a podcast. So of course, you have the initial startup costs, which aren't the biggest deal, but then you have monthly costs for hosting the podcast, and you have to buy space on the cloud. And I've hired a really excellent team member because I want this podcast to look and sound as good as it possibly can. So with all of that, the Thought Room ends up costing a couple $100 per episode to run. And your listener support really makes a difference. So if you have any interest in supporting the Thought Room financially, we have links in the show notes to our Patreon page. You can become a monthly supporter for just a couple dollars a month, which is less than the price of a coffee. Or if you would like to make a one-time donation, you can surprise us with that. And we have a link to the Venmo as well. There are, of course, other ways to support this podcast, not just financially. You can subscribe to it. You can share to your friends, to your neighbors, to your lovers, to your family. And you can also leave us a review. The reviews make a really, really big difference, particularly on Apple. If you go on there and you leave a written review, even just a few lines about your experience, it really helps with the integrity of the podcast. It helps other people find us in searches, and it also helps more prominent guests feel inclined to sit down with me. So without further ado, let's step into the thought room with Kyle Buller of Psychedelics Today. Kyle Buller, welcome to the Thought Room.
Thanks for having me.
Kyle, you and I connected on Instagram. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of overlap in our circles, and I saw that you were on an event in New York a couple weeks ago, and you were leading a breathwork workshop. And I looked you up, and I was like, oh, cool. This guy's a co-founder of Psychedelics Today. That's really rad. And then I started to read more in your bio about what you do. And you have done some really cool things. You've studied some amazingly cool things. You've studied transpersonal psychology. You have gotten into shamanism, plant medicine, holotropic breathwork. I saw that you've worked with at-risk youth at various points. I mean, this is incredible. Like your skill set is so varied. So I want to ask you, first of all, when we talked on the phone, you started to share with me a little bit about your life story. And this was part of the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast, because you started telling me the story and I got chills. And I would love if you would care to start us off with a little bit about your experience at 16 years old that kind of changed your life.
Sure. Yeah, it's been a pretty interesting journey, just kind of thinking about what I've been studying and just, throughout the years, it's been pretty interesting. So that story begins, I guess, at 15. I read a book called Snowboarding to Nirvana. I just started really getting into snowboarding. And this book was about an American going over to Nepal and ran into a Buddhist monk, and the monk taught him transcendental meditation, and he was using meditation as a way to access flow states and using snowboarding as a meditation. And I was like, this is awesome, So in the book, they had some like meditation practices in there, and I slowly started getting into meditation around then. And then about a year later...
at 15.
That was at 15. And then a year later, I went snowboarding, and I read that book on Christmas break during my freshman year, and then New Year's Eve, my sophomore year, decided to go snowboarding. I had some parties and friends that I was supposed to meet up with, and I was like, I really just want to go snowboarding. So me and my brother and his friend went out to the Poconos over in Pennsylvania. I grew up in New Jersey, and my brother's friend fell. We were only on the mountain for 30 minutes, an hour. He fell, hit his head, and we went into the lodge to readjust, recoup, make sure he was okay. And then I don't know if I said it or somebody else, but they were like, let's just take one more run. And that's the one thing you never say when you're skiing or snowboarding. It's just like bad luck to say, this is just one more run. So we went up and I planned out the longest run possible. I was like, all right, we're gonna go up, do this, do that. And just make it as much time on the mountain. And it was really kind of crappy conditions. I mean, if anybody grew up on the East Coast and skied, snowboard on the East Coast, just ice coast, just really crappy. And it was really warm during the day. So at night, the mound started to build up, and then it was just, really crappy conditions. And I was going around this one, I was on this one trail, and it was kind of like a snake. And so there's a lot of these like switchbacks. And I was booking it and just kind of straight lining the mountain. And I was on my toe edge going around this second turn, just really tight on the inside. And it's nighttime. So, you get all the shadows from the light. And as I was coming out of this turn, there was a mound of snow, and time started to slow down, and I was just like, oh shit, if I hit this, I'm going to die. So all these thoughts started racing through my head, and time just started to really slow down, and it was like tunnel vision. I just focused on this mound that was in front of me and said, I need to do something. So I tried stopping, I tried to turn, and everything just like was so quick. And I just saw myself hit this mound, and then everything started to go fast forward. It was like all slow motion up until I hit that. And then it was like fast forward, flew through the air about like 30 feet, I guess. And the nose of my snowboard hit and my shoulder hit, and I heard a loud pop. And I automatically thought, oh shit, I probably snapped a rib or whatnot. And my brother and his friends stopped. I probably slid down the mountain, I don't know, a couple feet, and I was just laid on my stomach grunting, like death grunts, like like couldn't breathe. So yeah, I really thought I just snapped a rib because it was just so much pain. And my brother and his friends stopped. They said, can you get up? I said, no. So they went down to try to go get some help. And then I was just laying face down in the snow, just doing this grunting because I was just in so much pain. And I watched all these parents and kids just pass by me. And it was these two punk ass snowboarders that were smoking cigarettes that actually stopped to help me. Like nobody else stopped, and they put a snowboard in front of me so nobody would run into me. Because I was like, going around the turn, nobody's going to see you come out, boom, hit me. So thankfully they helped. My brother came back and said, nobody's coming. And I was like, what do you mean nobody's coming? He's like, I don't know. I told the lifty, and, he just kind of shrugged it off. And so those kids got pissed, and they said, we're going to go down and get somebody. So thankfully, after they left, a random ski patroller stopped by and said, hey, are you okay? I said, no, like I have a lot of pain. I can't move. And so he tried to take my vitals, and, it's like, all right, we need to get you down. So luckily they got a toboggan. They got me down there. And in the meantime, I guess my brother was already at the lodge, and my dad was just hanging out waiting there, and some other kid came in, went like talked to his dad. I was like, oh my God, there's this kid that's like dying on the Nile Mile. That was the name of the run. And my dad was like, oh, it sucks for that kid, And then a couple minutes later, my brother came in and said Kyle got really hurt. He was on the Nile Mile. And I remember as the toboggan pulled up, my dad's like face just like dropped, just turned white. It was like, Kyle. So by the time I was down in the first aid, and they're checking all my vitals and everything, checking my ribs out, and they said, is your complexion usually this pale? Do you have a low pulse usually? I don't know. I don't think so. And they're like, well, your ribs are fine. We think you have internal injuries. And at that moment, I said, oh shit, I'm going to die tonight. Death became a real thing. And I didn't really grow up very religious, but I started praying. I said, God, I know I've never really had a relationship with you. I don't even know if you're out there, but please, I do not want to die tonight. I'm just too young. So luckily, the first responders medevaced me out. They didn't just take an ambulance. So they got the helicopter, and they medevaced me out, and I got to the hospital, and my uncle was there. He was a first responder for that hospital, luckily, and he was there and reassuring me that I was in good hands, and these people were going to help me. And by that time I got to the hospital, I started to kind of lose consciousness, or my consciousness started to expand. I don't really know how to describe it. I didn't really think about death. I knew it was going on. The nurses and doctors were freaking out, just trying to rip my clothes off and do all the things that they needed to do. And, I could hear one nurse like freak out saying like, I can't get his pulse, his veins in his upper body are collapsing. And they're trying to just like hook IVs up to me, but they can't tap into my veins. And I remember they had to like tap into my femoral artery, and, you know, my uncle's there. And I had a really interesting insight. I said, you know, this guy's family, but where I'm about to go, I can't take anybody, even though he's so connected to me. I said, you know, this is my journey. So then they ended up doing a sonogram, and they said, Kyle, like, you know, you have massive internal bleeding. This is probably why you feel so sick and you're in so much pain. We need to figure out where this is coming from. And by that point, it was like my spirit or my consciousness was really encompassing the whole room. And it was like I could feel the anxiety of all the nurses and doctors. And it was like, I guess I describe it like it was like my consciousness hooked into this oceanic feeling. It was like it's like consciousness is everywhere. It was like I was finally like hooked into everything, if that makes sense. It's so hard to try to put into words, but it felt like, you know, there's this consciousness or this energy. It's like an ocean throughout everything. And it was like I was hooked into that, and I could feel and tap into everything. So they brought me over to the CAT scan machine. And at that point, I was really starting to like fade away. They kept telling me, you know, I remember they were like on the loudspeaker, like, don't fall asleep, Kyle, don't fall asleep. Like just trying to keep me awake. At that point, you know, like before I got in there, they had me like with warming blankets on, and I'm just so cold. So I'm in the CAT scan machine. I can barely breathe because there's all this pressure on my chest. And then, you know, I'm just freezing. It feels like I'm like submerged in a tub of ice water because I literally just have no blood flowing through me. And I just remember after the doctor telling me not to fall asleep, it was like, I described it as this like orb of light. I don't really know what it was, but there was something that just kind of came to me and said, don't worry, relax into this. You're going home. And I was like, what? And it was like, you're going home. You're going back to the stars where we all come from. This is just a transition. Just relax into it. Your physical life's going to cease to exist, but you're going to continue on. And I said, I became overwhelmed with like bliss and love. It's like, oh my God, this is what I've been waiting for. This is amazing. And so I really started to like relax into my body and kind of let that process unfold. And then the doctors were just like, don't fall asleep, Kyle, don't fall asleep. And in my mind, I'm like, I'm going home. Like, this is what I've been waiting for, you know? And I accepted it. And there was just something so beautiful and peaceful about it. And so they got me out of there, and they said, you know, we need to do emergency surgery ASAP. Like, you rupture your spleen and you have massive internal bleeding. We need to get you in the surgery. So they got me out. They brought me to the ER, or the operating room. And, you know, I remember everything up to, they were explaining they were going to give me anesthesia, and that they were going to start counting backwards. And then the last thing I heard was, should we use a straight razor or an electric razor? And then I passed out. And then I woke up as they were wheeling me to the IC, the intensive care unit. I remember shooting up. This happened so quickly. I shot up from the bed as they were wheeling me through the hallway. And I took the biggest breath of air, like, and I shot up, straight up, and I just started shaking and convulsing. And in that split second, I heard, he's awake and he's cold. And then I just passed out, and then woke up in the intensive care unit, and my whole family's around me, and I'm just like, and, you know, I guess my memory is still there. I said, hey, is it still New Year's Eve? And they're like, it's only 9:30. I was like, are you serious? Like, I fell at like 7:30 or something like that. So I was still aware of like my time. I wasn't like knocked unconscious or anything where there was like a memory gap. I was like, did the ball drop? Like, no. And so that was just the beginning of something that, I mean, yeah, very life changing. The psycho-spiritual aspect. I mean, the physical trauma too, trying to like, you know, I have a huge scar on my stomach, and, you know, they had to really do emergency surgery. So, you know, getting back into shape and working with all that. But the psycho-spiritual aspect was probably the most challenging part of all this. It was like I kind of make it like a metaphor of like I woke up with a map on my chest, and the map is like how the world works. At 16, it's a lot of information to sort through, and so I went back to school, and it was tough for me psychologically, just because I was dealing with these heavy existential like questions of like what is life, what's death. I don't even know if I'm alive. Like there was a part of me that thought I was dead still, and I was in some sort of bardo state, and like maybe I'm not here. And then, I was on this huge high of like, I'm alive, like this is awesome. And then once these like thoughts started to become a little bit more concrete, then I started to feel like a pretty heavy depression. And yeah, it was pretty intense just to work through like what that experience was. And, in our culture, we don't really have too much of a framework to work with that. So it's kind of I was left on my own to try to figure it out. And I think that was like the most challenging, because everybody's like, oh, you should be happy. Like, you're alive. And, and on the inside, I'm like, I don't think you understand what the hell just happened. Like, psychologically, and maybe spiritually as well. Like, it was as if I went somewhere and I talked to something or someone, and I came back with like this new way of viewing the world. And I didn't really, the whole like seeing is believing thing. Like I didn't have that traditional near-death experience where I was like going down a tunnel of light and I saw all this stuff. Like I just knew. And it was that knowing just freaked me out, because I didn't have any context to put it to. And there's just something so deep in my bones. I was like, this is truth. And like, I'm like, how do I deal with this? So I went back to school, and yeah, it was pretty rough. I pretty much kind of stopped doing all my work and told the teachers that this was like all crap. I was like, you guys are just like factory producing kids with this bullshit education. And it was really challenging, just to kind of like, cause I think I just got a whole different glimpse of like what life is all about in a sense. And, yeah.
I can't even begin to imagine what it was like at 15, 16, trying to integrate that experience. And what I find is so fascinating about this is that you didn't have any, as you say, religious context or lens to apply this to help it make sense to you. And a lot of people, when they talk about their near-death experiences, they said, I was with God, or here you are, a kid with none of that, and yet you're feeling this truth. Mm-hmm. You don't know what it is, but like it's so immense that it's undeniable.
Yeah.
And then you come back, and you have to be here.
Yeah.
I mean, so then you're back in school. It all feels like bullshit. You're trying to, I guess, hang on to some sense of why this reality is important and why you have to keep doing the things that you were doing before. But it's like, you're awake now. Mm-hmm. So where do you go with your search? I mean, did you start looking up other people's near-death experiences or seeking out spiritual texts? Like, what did you do to try and make sense of this as you got a little bit older?
Right off the bat, I didn't do that. Like, I think I was just really trying to figure it out on my own. And, I guess I don't know, it really didn't click to try to do a lot of research. I mean, I think I did some here and there, but, actually what was the most helpful, and I just found an essay a couple of years ago and I read it. It was so dark. But one of my favorite classes in high school was, I think it was my junior English class, where we focused on existential writers. And I loved it because it was all about life is meaningless. So that, I think, was like my start of like just being like really influenced by like Camus and like some of these other existential writers of like, what is life? What's the meaning of life? And then, it probably wasn't until like after I graduated high school that I really started to kind of dig in. From that sophomore year to senior year, I was just, I don't know, I guess in my own process of trying to just be like a teenager, and then getting caught up with like all the different emotions that you go through during adolescence and relationships. And I was really kind of caught up in a relationship all through high school, and, the breakup and all that stuff. And so I think I was like more caught up in like social dynamics, as most adolescents are. But then like when I would go home, I would, kind of sit in these other feelings. So that journey, I guess really started after I kind of got out of high school, besides like the existential part. And, I think it started when I tried marijuana and just being able to have like these non-ordinary states. And I was like, I hated it at first. I remember the first time I tried cannabis, a friend of mine came back from the city. He was going to art school here and gave me a brownie, half a brownie. And it was terrible. I was praying to God, please, for it to be over. I was like,
tell me more about that experience. Like, what were you feeling? What was it like?
Well, we split and I didn't know anything. And he's like, oh, we'll go see a movie. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure.
You knew nothing.
I knew nothing.
Okay.
Like I'd never smoked weed. I think I drank like a few times here and there, but I didn't know edibles were like.
How old were you?
18 or 19.
Okay.
I didn't know. I think I was 18 because it was like the first year right out of high school. And I remember we ate it and he made me drive, not thinking about like a good, responsible friend being like, this is your first time. We'll make sure you're okay. Like he made me drive, like not thinking you're gonna be pretty messed up. So I remember eating it. And of course, like with edibles, it takes about like an hour for your body to metabolize it. And, I'm like, we're in the movie theater and all of a sudden we're in a huge circle talking. And I remember time just slowing down. I remember hearing, like kind of seeing the audio waves of people's voices like going through one ear and out the other. And then I was like, oh my God, what the hell's going on? And for the longest time, I thought I was dying. I was like, ugh. So I like curled up in a ball.
Like, not again.
Yeah, well, exactly. I was like starting to freak out. I was like, I think I'm overdosing, I'm dying. Like, because I think some of that euphoria reminds me of dying. Right. And I think that potentiates my anxiety around that because like when I'm entering that non-ordinary state, I'm like, oh my God, this is so familiar. And so, somehow I got through the movie, which was Jackass. So it was at least a funny movie. The humor was good. And then, but I was scared the whole time. I was like, this is so uncomfortable. And then, I don't know, this is the funny part. I guess like I couldn't drive. I couldn't reach into my pockets to grab my keys. Cause it was like reaching into this endless abyss that I just couldn't. I was like, where the fuck are my keys? And so I had another friend drive that was sober and, we're driving and my one friend that split the edible with me was like, we got to get some food. And I was like, no. I was like, we can't. I was like, my dad's going to be there. And he's like, dude, it's 12:30 at night. Your dad's not going to be a quick check. I'm like, no, dude, he will be. And
I love this story.
And so, we drive by, there's no cars.
Right.
And I was like, okay, maybe he's not there.
Dad's gonna be there.
And he's like, dude, you're just so high and paranoid right now. And so we drove by, there's no cars there. And he's like, listen, you're a little messed up. Let me just take care of ordering the sandwich. I was like, okay. So I go down and I grab these like pretzels that we all used to eat all the time, these buffalo pretzels. And I was like, yo, Akon. His name is Alex and his last name is Koncevic. So we used to call him Akon. And I have these pretzels in my hand. I'm like, yo, Akon. And I stop and my jaw drops. And my dad's standing in front of me. No. And I wipe my face. I'm like, oh, God. And he's like, what are you guys doing? And I'm like, so like, my body is melting. And I'm just like backing up against a beam. And I'm like, oh my God. And I look over at Akon. He's like, what the fuck? And then he's looking over at like these other friends. They're like, dude, does his dad? And then I'm just like, nothing. We went to go see the movies. He's like, are you guys on drugs? And I'm like, no. Whoa. And they were just harassing me the whole time. So I had to find the kid that had my keys. Like, yo, like, I need to grab the keys because if you get out of here and get in the car, my dad's going to be asking questions. So like he waited for us to like pay for everything. I went into the, we went out to the car. I got in the driver's seat and, luckily my friend didn't live that far away, literally lived like a block away at that point. So I felt comfortable. But we get in the car and they're like, dude, how the fuck did you know that your dad was going to be there? And I was like, I just knew, like Whoa. My body was telling me that he was going to be there. And
Wow.
so that experience lasted for like 24 hours. I woke up in the morning, it was like still going. I was like, when is this going to end? And at that point, I was freaking out. I was like texting friends, like, how long does this last for? They're like, I don't know, like 2-3 hours max. And I'm like, I'm going on 24. Like, what's going on?
Interesting. Do you think you were just particularly receptive to it at that point? Or that's so
I have no
wild.
idea. Yeah.
Wow.
It was like I just got this gut feeling, and I just felt like my dad was going to be there. And it's like, did I know that? Was it coincidence? You know, as Jung would say, like, there's just a synchronicity. Did my thoughts attract that? I don't know. And so, I don't really know how to answer that. You know, it's like one of those things. How do you measure that? How do you test it? Right. I mean, I've had a lot of experiences like that. I could go on and on about experiences that I feel in my body that manifest. What's going on there? I have no idea. Discernment is a huge part of that, is trying to discern whether these are paranoid thoughts or there's actually some sort of intuition there. And sometimes a lot of this stuff comes through like when I use cannabis. And so I think that's why I like non-ordinary states in some sense, because it's like some sort of weird madness, but there's a lot of intuition there as well.
Do you think we all have that intuition happening all the time? And sometimes these substances, or even non-ordinary, you're calling them non-ordinary states of consciousness. So I'd love you to just define that a little bit more. But in my mind, that could be a state that we enter into through meditation or something like that. Do you think these states kind of give us a doorway into that intuition, so to speak?
Yeah, I think so. I think everybody has access to it. It's just about cultivating a relationship to it. I mean, that was the one thing that I really felt after having that near-death experience, was like, we're all going to experience something along these lines. And we all have the capability of tapping into this intuition, this intelligence, this life energy, but most of us are just too busy. And the societal structures keep us busy, and we spend most of our attention just focusing on things that don't really matter, right? But we've created our world to make it matter. And so, what happens when you can actually start, spending more time being more curious about yourself and your relationship to the universe, then I think interesting things can start to unfold.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's incredible. I agree with you too. I think intuition is definitely something that can be cultivated, like exercising a muscle.
Yeah.
From the simplest thing of slowing down, and what I've been doing lately is trying to listen to what my body wants to eat.
It's huge. Listening to your body.
Yeah. And sometimes I'll notice a craving that's like a healthy craving, and I'll think like, oh, I could really just go for some kale today. Or, man, it's been a long time since I've had fresh tomatoes with some basil. And I feel like my body, in a way, is speaking to me about the micronutrients that I might be missing, or, in these subtle ways. So have you spent any time, or maybe periods of time, where you felt like you were super aligned with your intuition and things were just flowing? Or, what's your relationship like with your own intuition, and how have you kind of gotten a little bit closer to that?
It's been a long process. This is actually something I was thinking about a couple of months ago. I had a dream where at one point my life was just so flowy. Like, I didn't question anything really. I just knew I'm going to go do this, and felt pretty good. And then the past few years, I think because of just being in grad school and doing so much intense work, I think I've kind of falling out of that. And now that I'm wrapped up with all this stuff, I'm trying to cultivate it again. And so I don't know, life makes you kind of ebb and flow a little bit. But yeah, there were times when things were super flowy, and then things became concrete. I don't know, any of your listeners are like astrology folks, or if you're into astrology, but the time when it felt really constricted was during my Saturn return. So it was like, reality, pressure, everything's kind of closing in. And it was like, here's the structure, Saturn coming in saying, you need structure in the world. Here's time. It's starting to become real. And so it was like really flowy early on, and then hitting that return transit, it was like things started to become a little bit more real. And I'm like, oh yeah. So, I wouldn't say, well, maybe I wouldn't say it stopped, right? It's just developing a new relationship with it and going through a new sort of transition or phase.
Cool. Yeah. So I'd love to talk about Psychedelics Today and that as an organization, how you, I guess, got there to founding that. What's been your background, your schooling, and what motivated you to create this organization, which now, it's grown pretty widespread. You've got like 35,000 followers or something as of today on Instagram. And
I think we have well over 500,000 downloads for our podcast for all the episodes, which I think is pretty decent for a small niche psychedelic podcast battling against taboo and like all this stigma. So yeah, I think it's been growing. We've been doing it for the past 3 years, but the backstory to that, I would have to go back to, again, when I was 19 or 20. So, I had these experiences with cannabis, but I was still struggling mentally. Like, I started to experience a lot of depression, and the family and my environment that I was in felt really chaotic. Kind of grew up with a chaotic family and whatnot, and so I think that also played into my mental health at that time. And so having this really big transformative experience and coming back to an environment that wasn't really nurturing, really I thought about suicide a lot, and it was more like, I want to return to that feeling of home. That felt home. This here feels like hell, and I don't want to be in hell. And so a friend of mine had some mushrooms, and he's like, let's go out in the woods. And so I took it with this mentality that I kind of wanted to just say, fuck it, I want to escape. I really don't know what this is going to do. I had one experience beforehand, but it was very kind of small dose. And it was like, I had a good time. I laughed a little bit, and it felt nice. So I didn't know that experience definitely did not prepare me for this experience. So I think I ate around 2 grams or so. We went out into the woods, and I'm walking, and, as they started kicking in, things are starting to move. I'm looking at my body dissolving. I look down at my knee. My knees are just attached, and I'm watching my body just turn into molecules. And I'm like, oh my God, what the hell is going on? And we get to this tree, which I thought was an alien spaceship, just because, it looked pretty weird.
Very convincing.
It was. I was like, is this a spaceship?
My ride's here.
Yeah, exactly. And when we got to that tree, I became so interested in it. I started to examine it, and my friend puked his mushrooms up. And so at that point, I'm worrying, what the hell do we eat? Maybe he's sick, and, this whole thing about overdosing came in my mind. I didn't know that, they're the safest recreational drug. Overdosing is, you'd have to eat a lot of mushrooms to overdose, unless you pick a mushroom that's toxic and, you misidentified it.
What's a lot? I've always wondered that.
I think it's, I don't know, you listeners and whatnot will have to double check this, but it's, it's like kilogram. It's milligrams by kilogram, so it depends on your body weight and whatnot. But I think, they estimate anywhere around 50 pounds for a normal size person. And I don't think anybody's going to eat 50 pounds.
50 pounds of
something like that.
Mushroom.
Yeah,
wow.
It's a lot. They're one of the safest drugs or substances, fungi, food, whatever, I don't know, however you want to define that. But yeah, they're relatively safe on the safety side, toxicity wise. So, I started noticing my thoughts at that point. I'm getting really distracted by the tree and the beauty in it. And then I'd watch my thoughts go down in these really weird places. And then I could pull myself out and be like, whoa, where the hell was I? And it started freaking me out a little bit. I was like, what's going on here? I don't know if I like this. So we ended up walking. My friend was like, let's just keep walking. And then the feeling just started to become too overwhelming. And we were on this tiny little trail, and I found this little rock, and I said, I need to sit down. This is where I'm going to die. And so I sat on this rock thinking I'm going to die right now. And so I sat down and I couldn't.
Very calm about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess
I've
so.
been here before. I know.
Yeah, it was terrifying. And so I sat down on this rock and I said, this is it. I'm dying. This feels so familiar right now. I've been here before, and this is death. And then all of a sudden, the world and all the plants and trees had mouths, like teeth and everything. And then nature pretty much consumed me and tore me to pieces. Like I watched the trees and the plants just eat me. And I entered into this void of nothingness. I didn't know my name. I didn't know anything about myself. I didn't know what year it was. I didn't know what I did for a living. I was just in this complete kind of egoless state and, typical ego death type of experience. And it really, really freaked me out. I said, oh my God, what the hell is going on? And this might sound crazy to people that haven't had these experiences, but, I had this mystical experience at this point where I was in this void. And then I was like traveling through the universe and seeing like all these star systems. And I came to the edge of the universe and I started peering back and I saw myself. I started staring at myself from the edge of the universe, and I started to peer inside my mind, and then these entities appeared, these two little green guys, oval heads, beady black eyes, pointy ears, 3 long fingers, and they were in this cockpit in my mind, and at that point I said, oh my God, I'm not in control of anything. I was like, everybody's got these little deities around in their mind. I was like, we're just robots. So I started having some really, really weird thoughts. And it kind of freaked me out. And I thought, there's no way I can go back to life knowing this. It's like, I'm going to have to kill myself. It was really intense. And at that point, they started to come closer to me. And I said, oh my God, wait a minute. I was like, I've been here before. And I looked at these things. I said, have I been here before? And they said, thousands of times. And I was like, thousands of times? I was like, wait a minute, this must be some sort of death bardo then. I was like, this feels like the place that I went to when I died that one night. And so I asked them, is this where I went when I died that one night or came close to dying? And they said, more or less so. I was like, oh my God. I was like, okay, well, I'm putting all these pieces together. I'm in this death bardo realm. And, you said I've been here thousands of times. I was like, well, maybe this is God, or maybe this is the thing that I talk to. So I was like, are you the thing that I talk to? Are you the energy that gave me all this information? And of course, they're like, yeah, more or less so. It was a very trickster archetype. But that feeling felt so real. It felt more real than this life. And, a lot of people that had psychedelic experiences describe that. But the interesting thing was that experience felt so on par with my near-death experience. And I, all of a sudden, I had some more interactions with these things and it started to feel comfortable. It wasn't scary anymore. It's like, oh, this is where I went. And this is giving me so much more comfort to just kind of put that question to rest of where did I go that one night? And it was like this experience helped me kind of put it into perspective, that whole seeing is believing thing. I didn't have, as I mentioned, I didn't have going down a tunnel of light thing. I didn't have any visual context. And it was like this experience with that feeling plus the visual, just helped put it in perspective for me. And so, after I tell this story, people are like, was that real? That sounds crazy. I don't know. It felt real, but sometimes the way that I think about it is that there was trauma that wanted to be processed, and maybe this is how my psyche was contextualizing it and helped me to process it. Because when I woke up from that, my friend was sitting next to me. He said, just breathe, man. And so I took in this huge breath of air. And then he's like, just play. And he saved my life by saying those 2 words, those 2 sentences. And, then it felt like I had this total rebirth. I loved the experience afterwards. Everything was so blissful. So, I guess the way that I really view that experience was I had this significant trauma and, this was at the forefront of my psyche all the time. Where the hell did I go? What did I talk to? What is life? And this experience just kind of pushed it over the edge for me to have to kind of answer these questions. And so, yeah, psychedelics are interesting. So, that experience really got me super interested in what the hell's going on here, because I didn't know anything about these entity encounters, and I came across Terence McKenna soon after that, and he's talking about these self-transforming machine elves, and I'm like, what the somebody else have seen these things too? And then I started doing research, and people are talking about these, like, this phenomenon of having these interactions with these entities, and I'm like, what the hell's going on here? And I was in the bookstore one day, and I saw this book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. I forget what the subtitle is, but it's like investigations or research for DMT, near-death experiences. And it had nothing to do with DMT. The near-death experience popped out at me on the book title. I said, I need to read this. So I read it, and, as Dr. Strassman was hypothesizing, DMT is this it's a chemical or neurotransmitter, I don't know. And it's produced in the body, it's produced all throughout life, and like in different grasses and plants, like, and he hypothesized that DMT could be the molecule that was released at the time of death and birth and during near-death experiences. And, then I started looking at, like, the chemistry of DMT and psilocybin, and I said, oh, this is really interesting. So, if this hypothesis is that DMT is released when you die or during near-death experiences to produce these mystical experiences, maybe I had an endogenous release of DMT. Maybe this is what was happening during my experience. And then if you look at psilocybin, it pretty much has the same structure as DMT. I mean, it just has this extra group of phosphates attached to it, and that allows the liver to break it down to enter the blood-brain barrier. So psilocybin is kind of like this oral active dose of DMT. And so, I put that two together, and I was like, wait a minute, if I had this oral active dose of DMT, and then, I might have had this endogenous release of DMT, no wonder why these experiences felt so similar. And that just piqued my curiosity, where I was like, I need to study this stuff. And then I started coming across some of the research that was coming out of Johns Hopkins University, and all this old research that they did back in the the 60s with people with, like, terminal illness and dying, and treating, like, the near-death anxiety. And I said, well, that makes perfect sense, because for me, it's like these experiences are so parallel. That would make sense. So that really kind of got me interested in wanting to study more. And so I just started looking up, like, Terence McKenna. I came across the work of this Czechoslovakian American psychiatrist, Stanislav Grof, and just all this research on psychedelics and consciousness. I was interested in psychedelics, but also it's this bigger question of what is consciousness and what's life, and how these substances and molecules and plants and fungi and cacti can actually maybe help us give some insight on what's going on here. And that's what was most interesting to me, was to be able to have an experience with these mushrooms that was so on par with my near-death experience. And, like, that was just I decided to devote my life to trying to study this stuff. So I enrolled in a transpersonal psychology program up in Vermont, where I studied, I just did a lot of research on psychedelics and the history of psychedelic psychotherapy, and realizing, wow, people have been doing this stuff for a while. Indigenous cultures have been using these substances for a while. And I came across some teachers that taught holotropic breathwork, which was a technique developed by Stanislav Grof and his wife, Christina Grof. And, I was hearing all these stories about how powerful it was, and I was pretty skeptical at that point. I mean, I had it's like DMT entity experience, my near-death experience. Like, I don't really believe anything about breath work, and it was pretty profound. And it was all those experiences kind of wrapped up in one. And so I became really interested in breath work after that. I was like, wait, like, all these experiences just live inside of us, whether it's breath or you're taking a substance. All that's inside, these are just vehicles and tools on how to access that. And so I spent a lot of time doing my own breathwork sessions with my teachers, and then beginning training with them, helping them facilitate. And so I did my undergrad in transpersonal and really focused on breathwork, and ended up creating a course around psychedelics and breathwork. I was able to teach it as part of my capstone project, which was pretty fun. And then I worked in the mental health field for a few years, and my teachers asked me if I ever met this guy, Joe. No, I never met him. So they're like, you guys just really need to connect. So Joe used to go to these workshops way before, and he was already living out in Colorado at the point. And so we finally connected over the phone, chatted. And since he studied with the Gibsons, those are my breathwork teachers, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson, we had all these ideas to want to archive their talks, their kind of lectures and all their material, just so we could have it and also provide it back to the breathwork community. And then Joe already had some podcasts. He had like one about the occult, one on permaculture. He might have had another one. So we said, a lot of people aren't talking about breathwork and some of Groff's work in the psychedelic community. Let's just start a podcast. And so that's how Psychedelics Today started. So Psychedelics Today is a podcast. It's an education platform that we really focus on the science and the research and, some of the culture around psychedelics. And then we also really focus on breathwork and a lot of Stan's work as well. So we've been doing this since May 2016. And yeah, so it's been over 3 years. But how that got started was just my own experiences, and then just connecting with somebody else who had experiences with podcasting and, the same teacher lineage. And we just really kind of wanted to amplify that message. And it's been a fun ride so far. It's been really interesting. Get to talk to really interesting researchers and people that are in the field. So,
wow. What a journey.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting.
I love this image of going back to your story of your friend being like, just breathe, man, just breathe. And then that thread kind of coming back for you with the breath work. Mm-hmm. And this is something I'm really fascinated with is, because people are talking about psychedelics now. It's sort of becoming a trending thing, but I'm not hearing a whole lot about the breath work yet. And though it is something that I feel is given as a tool, or is starting to be given as a tool when it's like, everything else dissolves, come back to the breath, mm-hmm. anchored to the breath. And I find that I'd love to hear more about your opinion and experience of this like mystical thing that is the breath that just sort of anchors us.
I thought about that too, with my friend saying that when I came back. I was like, that is so weird he said that. And then, I'm so, like, my work has been in the breathwork world for a while. Like, that, just breathe, like, just stuck in my mind so much. And it was just so, I guess, synchronistic that I ended up finding breathwork. Breath, if you look at the etymology of it, like the Greek word spiritus means like life force, spirit. It also means to breathe. And if you look at cross-culturally at the definition of life energy, spirit, it always is connected with the breath. And so I think we're kind of disconnected from that, like thinking this is an autonomic function and, just there's nothing to it. We breathe, we stay alive. But also, even thinking about my near-death experience and coming to those last breaths, right? It's like we come into this world with our first breath and then we leave with our last breath. And so, it's our life energy. It's what keeps us here. And it is a really powerful technique and tool when you're able to become a little bit more conscious of your breathing and really how to manipulate your breathing to also access these states. And, it's so simple, and it sounds so simple, like when I talk about breath work, they're like, that's it. Like, how could you have these experiences by just breathing? And I don't know. I don't think we really understand the physiology or like the biochemistry behind what's going on. And we know that like the blood becomes a little bit more alkaline and there's a little bit more CO2 in the blood at that point. But, I don't think we really understand how that's really shifting our consciousness or what that's really doing. So I don't have any of the background on that. I mean, it's really interesting that, you know, you could intensify your breathing and access these other states of consciousness. And, you know, from my experiences, it's like we all have these tools, whether that's plants or doing physical activity. I mean, if you look at any sort of rites of passage in indigenous cultures, it either like involved isolation, physical strenuous activity, or like bloodletting, something that's like, you know, it's physical, like physical pain and whatnot. And then other, you know, cultures use psychedelics and plant medicines or like breath, you know. And so I don't think there's one tool just to access these states. It's, you know, you can access it in much different ways with a variety of tools. But
Yeah, I love this topic. And I think my first awakening to breath work, I mean, I didn't know that's what it was then, but a friend had sent me this video. She said, "Oh, you have to do this meditation on YouTube." And, you know, I'd never done any psychedelics or anything like that. I just was starting to get into some weird, cool things. Actually, it started off because I was getting into reading about Tantra and energy flow and breath, using the breath, you know, to kind of heighten that state. And she said, "You got to do this meditation. It's on YouTube. It's called the Ananda Mandala meditation." And it's basically this person just counting like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And you breathe in and out with the count. And then it kind of goes through the chakra system. And you just kind of just loftily focus your awareness on each one of the chakras as you're doing this 1, 2. But it kind of speeds up. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I was just like, okay, follow the directions, blah, blah, blah. And I started to feel real weird.
yeah.
And my friend kind of warned me. She's like, you know, it's a little bit intense, you know, but you just like, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. And I was like, okay, so don't stop. Like that was the only direction I had. And I remember, and in between each one of the chakras, they have you like hold the breath at the exhale. So you're like holding it out and you already have no air and you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, I've been breathing on a 1, 2 count really rapidly. So I started to feel like tingliness in my fingers, and I've been doing this about 20 minutes and was just totally immersed in this. And by the end of it, I felt like these electrical pulses through my jaw. I felt like my fingertips were vibrating. In fact, my fingers were kind of in this like lock.
Tetany is what it's called.
Which I didn't know at the time. I was just like, oh my gosh, I've messed something up. Like I texted my friend after, I was like, what the hell was that? Like I just blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I've never experienced anything like that. And she's like, oh, well, you know, it's breath work and there's a natural DMT release. And I was like, I don't know what DMT is, but that was crazy. And I don't even know if I'd smoked cannabis. So this was like a through the roof sort of experience for me that I couldn't explain. But
it can be really powerful. I've talked to a lot of people that were really skeptical of it. I mean, I was very skeptical of it. And breathing is very powerful. I mean, if you think about it, your breath really controls so much. You know, it controls a lot of your physiology, controls, you know, your emotions. If you look at like body posture and also how you're breathing, I mean, it really affects a lot of who we are and how we're functioning. And to be able to consciously control that or manipulate it, I mean, you can really do a lot of interesting things. And, you know, as you pointed out in some sense that you're doing this 1, 2, 1, there's so many different ways to go about breath work. There's so many different techniques. You know, some are very activating. So deeper, faster breathing can be more activating, get energy flowing, can bring things up to the surface. Then you have, you know, slower, deeper breaths that can be really activating for the parasympathetic nervous system. It can be much more calming. That's why people really recommend that if you're having anxiety, deep, slow breaths, activate that parasympathetic nervous system, slow down. And then you could also do, different breathing techniques. Like say if you feel like anxiety in your body, you really want to kind of explore that, taking a couple deep breaths and experimenting with breath that way to maybe even explore that feeling. And so there's ways to even incorporate it somatically to experience things differently. And so the breath is so diverse, and there's so many different techniques out there. I mean, yogic breathing, more meditation, breath awareness, things like holotropic breath work. And so, it's a really interesting field. And, there's a lot more people doing this work. And there's, lots of different models out there that people can like research or get into.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. I think that a lot of people do think this is kind of far out, but when we break it down like this, the breath is everything. I mean, even when you're running, you're going on a run, your breath starts to have a certain rhythm. Mm-hmm. That's why when people finish a run, they're like, oh man, it feels so good. Well, you're oxygenating your whole body. Yeah. You're stirring things up, you're cleansing. Same with yoga. Mm-hmm. Meditation puts us into a different state, kind of calms us down. And as you were saying with the anxiety, it's like that classic sort of tableau of a person on an airplane breathing into a bag. Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're using the breath to consciously change the internal state. Yeah. So cool. So cool. But not something that everybody's aware of.
Right.
A lot of people, especially, I live in New York City. I walk around and I have days where I will sit down on the subway and go, you're not breathing. Mm-hmm. You're not breathing. Your breath is like, like a little shallow. And it's like, whoa. And if I just quiet myself, I can feel my pulse just dun, 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 and I'm like, wow, okay, let's change this. But what I would like to ask you is, is there like one tip or like one short walkthrough of here's a really basic way when you're experiencing anxiety to just kind of like hit the reset?
Well, I think even just what you said there is to go, 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 and then just to be aware. I mean, that's a huge step, to be aware that I'm not breathing, right? Because I focus on this. Like, this has been part of a lot of my research and interest, and I get caught up. We all get caught up in life. Like, and I even have to just be a little bit self-aware at times. Like if I notice I start to get a little anxious or like a little tight, I have to like just pause and be like, okay, I feel I'm not breathing, right? So I think like, if anybody is like feeling, maybe a little anxious, a little tense, like I think to really start is just slow down and just pay attention to your body. What are you feeling right now? Do you feel any constriction in your chest? How are you sitting? Like, how's your posture? How are your shoulders? Are you hunched over and breathing very shallow? Or are you sitting up and with your, your shoulders open? Are you taking big breaths into the belly? And so even just to experiment and to become self-aware on your breathing, and, just to become a little bit more self-aware of your body and your emotions and your breath. So, I just encourage anybody to just, whatever you're doing right now, even just kind of check in with yourself and be like, how do I feel? What's my body telling me? How's my body posture? And if you are kind of like hunched over, we're a hunched over culture. We're constantly looking at our phones. We're hunched over. I mean, I'm hunched over to make sure I'm in the microphone, right? So what would it be like to even just sit back and throw your shoulders back and take a deep breath?
That feels great.
Notice something a little bit differently, right? Instead of like hunched over, making sure we're talking into the microphone to keep consistency with our shoulders crunched over and maybe breathing a little shallow.
I love this. Yeah.
So I think it really just comes back to self-awareness and cultivating some self-awareness.
Yeah.
We can't always constantly be practicing, right? Because then we really wouldn't be functioning. But to even notice when you're feeling a little out of line, just kind of check in with your body and check in with how you're doing.
Yeah. The other day I was kind of anxious for no reason? Do you ever have those times where
All
you're
the
just
time.
so I was like in the apartment and you notice yourself doing useless things, like picking up an item and then like putting it down somewhere else and then like picking up it again, and then was like filling a kettle, but then I didn't turn it on. And I was like, whoa, Hal, like what is going on?
Yeah.
Like, what do you need, buddy? Like,
Right. Yeah.
let's check in. Okay, let's let the body drive for a little bit, because the mind has no fucking clue what's going on. The mind is like grasping, like, let's pick up the book, let's pick up the kettle. Like, I don't know what to do because I'm uncomfortable. So again, I love this. Just slowing down, asking the body, what do I feel? And, you know, what do I want to feel too? And kind of pouring our energy there versus, because I think it's so easy to be like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so anxious and like this whole day is a wash and I should blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, no. Just very pragmatically, what am I feeling? Noted. That's what I'm feeling. Okay. Can I let this feeling be here? Can I just allow that? And also let me shift my point of attention or attraction or awareness to where do I want to go from here?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, you just even saying like your mind's like thinking, right? It's interesting. Like, you know, yoga has become a very physical type of experience. And, you know, this feels like a generalization. And it's like we're so sometimes connected to our body in the sense that, you know, people like physical activity, they're doing yoga, exercising, but we're also so detached from our body. And we really spend a lot of time in our mind. We're a very cognitive type of cerebral culture. And, you know, the mind is trying to make sense of what the body's telling you. So taking into some somatic research, it's like, you know, your body is registering things first and your mind's trying to make sense of it at times, right? So like, you know, when people say they get a gut reaction, right? Like there's some science behind that of like the vagus nerve goes from the brainstem all the way down to the gut. And when you feel that, it's like, boop, send something to the brain, and then you need to try to make sense of it. Or even if like I go to punch you or like just reach my hand out, your body's going to react first, and then your mind's going to be like, oh, I need to pull away, right? And so the body knows what it's doing. It has an intelligence in a sense. And so how can we start to maybe cultivate a little bit of a relationship and self-awareness of what our body's telling us? Because we're constantly trying to make sense of it. So what would it be like to actually feel those sensations and feel the body versus I need to make sense of what my body's trying to tell me? So actually just sitting in the feeling of whatever's going on. We're very detached from that aspect of actually just sitting with feelings in our body. And there's a lot of intuition there. I think that's kind of where intuition sits at times. It's in the body. Something is like sending us responses. And sometimes we can brush it off and be like, oh, whatever. And then other times when you get that gut-wrenching feeling, like you just know something's wrong, right? And you can sit there and think and analyze it, but something in your body saying something's off. Listen to me, right? So even, I think just cultivating some sort of body awareness and learning how to become aware of feelings. You know, it's funny, when I was doing my internship, I incorporated a lot of somatic stuff with my clients, and I'm like, you know, just pay attention to any feeling in your body. And they're like, I don't feel anything. And it's like, you have to even educate what a feeling is, right? Like, do you feel a tightness? Are your muscles relaxed? Do you feel any heat, cold? Maybe there's some dullness there. And then, you know, it's like, we don't even kind of know what we're feeling half the time. And then when, you know, I point that out, they go, oh yeah, actually it feels a little hot right there, right? What does that feeling of heat in your shoulder feel like? Like, what is it telling you?
Incredible. Yeah. It's good stuff. I'm thinking about, you know, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but in your circles, this stuff that you're talking about is pretty ubiquitous. Like, people listening to this, and in some of my circles too, are just nodding and going like, yeah, I've experienced this. This makes perfect sense. Yes to all this. And then perhaps there's others out there listening who this is just way out of their scope. They've never heard anything like this. They're still operating on that old paradigm of psychedelics being drugs that fry your brain and don't do drugs, and stay in school, which is like great. You and I also talked about the balance of these two worlds and how important it is to really thoughtfully discuss and look at both sides of these. But we're seeing this trend now, particularly in North America, with the MAPS research that's happening and legalization of psilocybin in, was it Denver?
Decriminalization. In Denver.
Right. Correct. So multiple things like that happening in different cities. And there's science to back up where this is going. And people are really, seemingly becoming more open to using some of these substances medicinally. And I would love if you could speak to what you're noticing as far as the trends happening.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, the science is coming out. Science is validating some of what we already know. There's actually been a lot of research done. The main, I guess, renaissance that's happening now, and a lot of the researchers and scientists, their argument of what happened in the 50s and 60s wasn't up to today's standards scientifically, with the rigor, with the double blind, the gold standard of science at this point. And it was much more kind of like experimenting and just a much different type of science. But there's evidence there, and they did a lot of research. I mean, LSD is probably one of the most researched compounds or medicines. It was used medicinally back then, so I'd call it a medicine at that point, just like any other pharmaceutical medicine that they've been researching. LSD has a pretty good track record of research, even though it might not have been meeting today's standards of double-blind placebo. But if you go back even further, a lot of these substances, not the semi-synthetics like LSD or something like MDMA, more plant-based psychoactive substances, I mean, they've been around for a pretty long time. And they've been used mostly kind of in healing and divination, more ritualistic, ceremonial type settings. And it's kind of shifted over time, like before, in shamanic cultures, maybe the shaman would, and that could be male or female, would take, say, something like ayahuasca or the mushrooms to go into these realms to do healing work on their patient or the person that came to them sick. And now, I mean, you're seeing people actually, everybody participate. And so it's shifted a little bit on how that's operating. But a lot of people sometimes don't even realize that the use of psychedelics goes back very far in history. There's just a report, archaeological report that came out that they found a medicine bag, I believe, with traces of the plants used to make ayahuasca that, they're thinking at least 1,000 years. If you go back to the Greek culture, the cradle of Western civilization, I mean, they were probably using various there's one particular rite called the Eleusinian Mysteries. The rites went on for about 2,000 years, and Plato, I believe, went through there, and a lot of these Greek philosophers went through some of these rites, and some researchers hypothesized that they were using some sort of psychoactive brew as kind of like a tool for this initiation. Nobody really knows what happened in there. The poet Pindar spoke about it and wrote, "It's dying before dying." Other than that, we don't know too much. We don't really know what they were using, but a lot of people suspect that it could have been some sort of ergot-derived type of drink. Ergot is a precursor to LSD. It's a fungus that grows on rye, and so the use case goes back a while. And, it wasn't until the discovery of LSD that it started to become more medical and researched in that context, when Albert Hofmann first synthesized it. And so, when they found this substance, they just kind of shipped it off to a bunch of different, research places. And there's got to be something here. Albert Hofmann thought, like, this is a really interesting molecule and there's got to be some sort of clinical application. So they tested it for a very long time, up until really the counterculture hit. And the thing that I guess people should know about drug policy is that drug policy is usually based around marginalized people and also how to marginalize people. So, for example, a lot of the psychedelics were caught up in the hippie movement. Hippie movement was, free love, good times, but it was also associated with the anti-war and anti-establishment movements. Well, you can't technically arrest people for their thoughts and whatnot, but you can arrest them for using a substance, right? And here's something that's objective that they can say, you have this, and so we can arrest you for it. And so, you can look at something like marijuana, right? That was a really racist thing as well, targeting blacks and the Latino folk. And so if you look at drug policy in general, it's just a very kind of like racist type of thing and just a way to marginalize people and take advantage of people in a sense. And so, we're really trying to get over the stigma here of what happened in the 60s. And, a lot of people are like, oh, people went crazy back then. And there's a lot of like, that probably happened. I wasn't around, so I can't attest to what really happened. But we also have to take into consideration, these are very powerful substances. And this was like giving a knife to a baby, right? These are totally new tools. Western culture has no context for these states of consciousness. It's like we're a baby exploring this new territory, and it probably got a little out of hand.
It's like you eating your edible and your friend
exactly.
saying, let's go to watch Jackass.
Yeah, there's no context
right.
there. And I believe that's probably why a lot of the folks attached to a lot of Eastern philosophy during that time, why yoga started to become a thing and meditation started to become a thing, because those had context to these states of consciousness and these experiences. Our culture right now is just so removed from a lot of this. Our cosmology doesn't encompass these types of experiences, like if I was part of I guess for example, when I started to study my transpersonal psychology degree, I met a teacher who's part Lakota, part Cherokee, and European. And he became my teacher to teach me shamanic techniques and shamanism and whatnot. And when I told him my story, he said, if you lived in a traditional culture, the elders would have stepped in and taught you what you needed to know with your new way of seeing. And when I think about that, we don't have any of that. When you start to talk about spirit encounters and more animistic worldviews, that's associated with schizophrenia and craziness. But in these other cultures, that was part of their cosmology. There wasn't really anything too crazy about that. And they had systems to really understand how to navigate that and maybe come back and maybe how not to go crazy. Because, there's probably, my teacher told me a similar story when, I don't know if he went there or he heard this story from a teacher, but this group on a safari stopped in an African town, and this one quote unquote crazy person came up to the truck, and they're and somebody on the safari is like, oh, that must be the village shaman, and somebody part of the village is like, no, that guy's just crazy. And so there's also a sense of romanticism where we go, oh no, all these states are fantastic, and sometimes people can go over the edge with it as well. But I think like during that time, we just didn't really have a system to really understand the power of these substances. And then research dried up, and now it's starting to come back. It started in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, I think the first kind of psychedelic study that got started was with Rick Strassman studying DMT, dimethyltryptamine, in the 90s. And then Johns Hopkins, UCLA, they've been studying psilocybin for near-death anxiety. And that was already done down in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Institute. When Stan Groff and Bill Richards and a few other folks were there, there was a place called Spring Grove where they're using psilocybin for near-death anxiety. So that research seems new, but part of it was already kind of done in a sense. And now we're just kind of also validating sometimes what has been done. You mentioned MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're using MDMA for PTSD. So if nobody knows what MDMA is, sometimes it's known as ecstasy. Ecstasy is usually a pill that contains MDMA, but sometimes it contains a lot of other things and doesn't contain any MDMA. So MDMA was originally used in therapy, in couples therapy, back in the 70s and 80s before it escaped and went into the rave scene. One of my teachers had legal MDMA sessions. And so, these things were always used in therapeutic contexts. And Maria Sabina, the medicine woman that introduced Gordon Watson and Valentina Watson to the mushroom, and Gordon Watson and his wife kind of brought that knowledge back, and that's how mushrooms really kind of got more popular. I remember watching a presentation, and somebody was saying that she kind of regretted letting them in, and one of her reasonings was that she said the Western people are just so visually oriented, and they're just it's like, oh, all the pretty colors that are happening with psychedelics. But she's like, in our culture, it was mostly about the internal experience. It was about the emotion and connecting with the spirit. And, sometimes that's weird in our culture to want to connect to ourselves, or connect to something bigger. That's classified as woo-woo, or that's like new agey or whatever that is. But is connecting with yourself new agey or weird? I think that's part of, it's deep in our bones to want to connect with ourselves. And really, that isn't that the base of philosophy? Who are we and what are we doing here? And to be able to cultivate a relationship with ourself and the universe. I think that's part of the human experience and not very woo-woo or weird at all. Yeah. And you have these tools that have been used traditionally throughout cultures to either cultivate that or in healing. And so, it's a really interesting time with all the research that's coming out right now. So right now, MDMA is going into phase 3 clinical trials with the FDA, and so is psilocybin, which is the main active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and those could be legal pretty soon for therapeutic use. And so it's exciting. A lot of people are starting to become interested in it through Michael Pollan's book. I don't know how many emails we used
How to Change Your Mind. How to
Change Your Mind. Yeah, I don't know how many emails we've gotten that started. I read Michael Pollan's book, and and a lot of these folks are older. They were people that, baby boomers, or people that might have had psychedelic experiences or just on the cusp after the 60s, and they're like, I was interested in it. Now I'm starting to become interested because of all the science that's coming out. So yeah, it's an interesting time for sure, and be interesting to see where it heads in a few years. When I first started becoming interested in wanting to do this research, I thought trying to get involved in any of this stuff was way far off. And in the last decade, it's just really taken off. It's been kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's happening rapidly. And I love Michael Pollan's book as well. It's what I find so interesting about that book is he calls himself out saying, I had no experience with this. I'm not a psychonaut. I'm not a druggie writing this. He's a journalist. Yeah. He's written on food and, a variety of other topics.
Farming.
Exactly.
Gardening.
And he was just kind of blind going into the whole situation. And I think that makes him kind of the perfect person to deliver something like that, because I think with something so immense as this, and really outside of a lot of people's comfort zone, because there's so much cultural conditioning and fear surrounding it, which I think, isn't to be demonized too much, because as we said, this is an incredibly powerful tool. They're all tools: yoga, meditation, breathwork, psychedelics. One is not for everyone.
No.
This is not a blanket one size fits all, and it's really important to use these tools carefully. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, working with any sort of non-ordinary or holotropic state of consciousness, I mean, we get emails of people that go into this work saying like, I thought, this was going to be healing, and now I'm struggling even more with anxiety. And when I think about something like my near-death experience, totally natural. I mean, it could really happen to anybody. Cross the road, you get in the car. I mean, it really can just happen at any point. To be shaken to the core and exposed to a new way of thinking, that's where a lot of the trouble comes in. Like I said, we have no container in our culture. We lack certain rights, and our cosmology just does not encompass these worldviews that can sometimes come from these types of experiences. There's a lot of research that says people who view psilocybin feel more connected with nature. I mean, our culture isn't really nature-based. We're very consumer-based. And if you want to connect with that, then you're the oddball out, because then you're not running the rat race as everybody else is, and you're kind of then struggling with, how do I reintegrate into a society that's so consumer-based? And maybe I'm starting to see that this isn't healthy for me or the world or my community. And so, there can become a lot of like anxiety and a lot of like push and pulls between like your belief system of like, oh, I just had this really powerful awakening, but my community and the people around me just do not understand it. Or maybe I'm starting to feel really isolated. And that's totally a risk. I mean, I definitely went through it, and still kind of go through it at times. I definitely feel like the oddball out at times with a lot of different things. And yeah, and I think that is part of the risk. Some people find great healing in it, but then you also have to deal with some of the deep philosophical questions that come up, and then how am I living my life afterwards? And that is really the focus of a lot of my work. Integration, which, obviously comes from the psychedelic experience, but I mean, really my near-death experience, that is the most psychedelic experience I've ever had. And 16 years later, like, I'm still trying to figure out what the hell it means and what I'm doing. And I always have this push and pull, like, this, that. And, I come back to these deep philosophical questions, and I feel like I battle up against, like, these social constructs. I don't have anything to do with it, but I also want to be integrated into it. And, it's
a dance.
It's a dance. Yeah.
And, you and I talked about this a little bit on our initial phone call, but I love what you mentioned about these elders in these communities and sacred rites of passage. And I told you when we first talked that I was so inspired by a vision quest I went on, which, historically was a rite of passage in Native American culture. For generally it was the boys to go off and fast for several days alone in the wilderness. I did a vision quest myself, and then I came back and I started what now is my company, Lunar Wild, which is a sacred rite of passage gift for young women when they first start menstruating. And we were talking about this deep-seated, ubiquitous loneliness that just permeates our whole culture, but particularly the youth. And it's getting worse. Yes, the social media definitely has something to do with it, and it's happening so rapidly. I saw it because I was teaching in schools, and it's super destabilizing. People don't have anywhere to turn with these issues. And I like what you said about feeling like the odd person out, because I think that is a part of the human experience. Like, we all feel on some level like we're the odd person out. Like, isn't that just so hilarious to marinate in for a second?
It's very tribal, right? Because like, you want to be able to fit into your tribe. Otherwise, that is like isolation.
Means death.
Death. Yeah. So at some point, it's just an evolutionary trait to not want to be alone and to be part of the tribe. As my teacher Lenny said, we're the descendants of very successful tribes. And, that's something that kind of is missing, the group process aspect. And yeah, I think to be outside the tribe meant death in a sense. So yeah, I think it's a rational fear at times. But yeah, you can keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was it basically. So I guess I want to ask you, if someone listening to this has never had a psychedelic experience and they're now like, I want to read a little bit more about the science of this in particular. We mentioned Michael Pollan's book, but do you have a place where you would send someone who is just sort of getting curious about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it depends on your interests. I think Michael Pollan's book is just a good intro. He's easy to read, a good quick intro. If you're starting to become a little bit more interested and you want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the research, you could go to some place like maps.org and just look at the research that they're doing with MDMA. If you're a science nerd, if you have access to article databases, you can dig up some of the research in there. I'm sure there's some research on Google Scholar as well. But also Psychedelics Today is a really great place. I mean, we have tons of interviews with, I think probably over this point, at least over 150 interviews. And we have some online education where we kind of break down our framework, harm reduction, safety, preparation, understanding the psychedelic experience, and what does self-care and integration mean. So we have some free courses up there. We have our paid courses where we also do like live support. And so, yeah, I think starting at Psychedelics Today, and there's a bunch of other psychedelic websites out there as well. There's a lot of great resources out there. If you, another resource that we typically refer people to is erowid.org.
EROWID.
Yeah. And that's just a great archive of stuff. So, yeah.
Amazing. So just briefly, I want to ask you about what you're currently working on. I know you have Setting Sun Wellness, which is kind of your own thing as well. And then what other things are you currently launching, and how can we stay up to date on that?
Yeah, so at Psychedelics Today, we're really just focusing on education at this point. So we have our podcast, and then we're also focusing on education right now. We're running 2 live different classes. Well, it's kind of the same class, but different populations. So we have a class called Navigating Psychedelics, Lessons on Self-Care and Integration. We do a 5-week course where you have 5 online meetups with Joe and I, and then the rest of the class, we keep it pretty small and interactive on Zoom. I think we cap it off at 12 people, just so we have more of like an intimate type of online classroom where we can have discussion. We have one for the general public. So if anybody's just starting off, they don't know anything about psychedelics, and they just want a good overview of preparation, safety, and just like a really good framework for understanding this, and resources and community, comes with like a nice little community in Slack. Slack is like a communication tool that we use. A lot of businesses use it, but it's kind of like a little chat room. So we get access to that, a Facebook group. And then the other audience that we're teaching for is for therapists and clinicians. So we have a Navigating Psychedelics for clinicians and therapists, where we just kind of the same material, but then we also have extra material that focuses more on clinical application. A lot of therapists are starting to read this stuff. So like exploring questions, my client is coming in talking to me about psychedelics. What do I do? How do I support my client? What are some of the ethical implications here? Like, how do I show up ethically in the room? If I had my own psychedelic experiences, if somebody is open about their psychedelic experiences and people are reaching out for like integration services, how are you showing up in the room like that? How to maybe get started providing integration services, and even how to get started. It's almost like there's only a few different routes to really gain education in this world. You could do an undergrad or master's in transpersonal psych or somatic psychology and get that. Like, I think to do the therapy route, you need to do that. But, and then the other route, if you're in the therapy world, is only the MAPS training or another training at CIIS. And so we want to also give people a head start in really understanding the basics of this framework and psychedelics. So yeah, we're really just focusing on education. We have, I think, 4 classes coming up in the fall, 2 for the general public, 2 for the clinicians and therapists. And people can check that out at psychedelicstoday.com. And there's a tab for online ed or online courses, and you can just follow the correct link that you're looking for. So that's what we're currently working on right now, is just really doing the education. And then for Setting Sun Wellness, that was actually like my first website that I started when I was living in Burlington with a bunch of friends. And that was really just a place for us to host breathwork workshops. And since I moved away from there, I'm still connected with them. My buddy Lucas helps me out every once in a while with different workshops. And so that's more of my personal site. Slowly starting to think it might transition, like if I get licensed, might transition into like my private practice or my therapy site. But for right now, it's really focused on breath work, non-ordinary states, and spiritual emergence. And so another friend of mine, Michelle Hobart, we're doing a course, another online course called Awakening Healers, how to support people in spiritual emergence. And also, if you're going through an awakening process, like what is it like to go through this? How do you support yourself? How do you find the community? And, some people that are in this process of waking up or having a spiritual emergence crisis, and a spiritual emergence is kind of like a play on words. It describes a psycho-spiritual kind of crisis.
Emergency.
Emergency, yeah. But it also is there's a potential to emerge out of that crisis into a higher level of functioning and consciousness. And so, a lot of people that go through these experiences sometimes get called into wanting to be a healer or offering healing services. So, this course focuses on how do we provide a support group for people that might be going through this or have gone through this, and also how are we stepping into these healing roles if you're being called to do that? Because there's a lot of people that they have these experiences and they go, oh my God, like what am I doing with my life? I want to be doing this. I have a client that I'm working with who just has a regular job, and he's like, I just wanted being more in this healing space, something more meaningful. So yeah, just providing that space to explore how to really move through these sometimes challenging experiences and maybe move into a new role of healership. Because if you look traditionally, like the shamanic illness, for example, like people usually go through these big trials and tribulations. Or even in the counseling field, a lot of people talk about that this is a calling, right? People get called to this work. Usually the quote, like wounded healer, like we've been through our own stuff and now we want to give back. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. And breath work, offering breathwork workshops around New Jersey here and there.
Amazing. Incredible. I can think of so many people who I want to tell about that program. I think that is such a common experience for people. When I hear about their psychedelic journeys, it's like, after what I've seen, this is the only thing that makes sense, is to help others be in this beautiful but also deeply uncomfortable experience of being a human being, and what it means to sit in it. Again, it's like the feelings. It's like we have a choice to kind of numb ourselves with food and sex and alcohol and cigarettes and all these substances and media and TV, whatever. Or the alternative is to just sit in what is really coming up. Yeah.
And learning how to transmute that into something else.
It kind of feels like being okay with vomiting. It's just like, I know I'm going to feel better if I just let this come up. But like, damn, when you're in it, it's so shitty. Yeah. It's so shitty. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think even just like working through that is really challenging. I think, thinking about that course, Awakening Healers, it really comes back to Michelle and I's like personal experience of like having these experiences and then learning how to like maybe step into the power. That's hard. Like it's something I still struggle with here and there. It's like, wait, am I doing this healing thing? And then get mixed messages.
Or is this my ego wanting me to be a healer?
Right. Yeah. And so sometimes it's a real challenge to step into these roles, because there's a lot of like just different things that am I right for this? Right? Like, am I really being called to do this? What does
Am
that
I
even
good
mean?
enough?
I'm not good enough. Yeah, exactly. And then you get into the whole like money thing too, money and healing, right? Like that's a whole other topic. And
Right.
people have like a lot of healers and people in that profession have a real tough time accepting money. And there's a weird thing about exchange, energy exchange there. And like, how do we be a little bit okay with that? Right.
Right. Well, and rightly so, because I think that there, of course, are people out there who are calling themselves healers
Oh,
who
yeah.
have manipulated people in the past, and it's sad, but it gives the other people a bad rep, you know?
And kind of like that imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
right? Like there's people out there just kind of stepping into this work that might have very few experience, and then you have the person that's been doing this work for 20 years and still pretty hesitant about wanting to step into the role, right? They're like, oh, but this person's been doing it for a year, but it seems a lot bigger, right?
Right.
And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of interesting dynamics there when wanting to get involved in that work.
Yeah, this resonates with me too, and I'm sure, you know, you do personal coaching as well, right? Or
Yeah.
you have in the past. And I struggle with that too. I always want to check myself and be like, am I helping? I really need to know that I'm helping. And you know it, but it's also so good when people are like, "Oh yeah, this is really helping." Oh, okay, I'm good. I'm aligned. I'm doing what I set out to do, because I think for me, the fear is I'll get too comfortable and my ego will run away, and then I'll be like, "Yeah, I'm this great coach," and like blah blah blah. Like even launching this podcast has been deeply vulnerable, because who wants to put themselves out there for people to listen and pick apart? And
It's tough. I mean, starting my podcast has been no easy thing, because there's definitely been something around my voice and like that throat chakra. So actually podcasting and being able to speak my story and get that out there has been healing. But I mean, it's not easy. It's probably been one of the most challenging things that I've done, because it's so vulnerable and raw, and it's just like there's a lot of wounds there too, right? And so like trying to work through that, and you know, just even a lot of those self-doubts, self-criticisms, like I'm not good enough, who wants to listen to this? Yeah, that totally comes up, and it's
like we don't want to make mistakes, but at the same time, I kind of want to make mistakes because I want people to see me make mistakes and know that it's okay. But then there's a part of me that's like, no, I want everything to be perfect. So it's just this dichotomy to be in, and to have it be this very public process that you're allowing others to enter through this membrane of sometimes the fucked up mind that you have.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting experience.
It is.
Yeah. So cool.
Very interesting.
Amazing.
That's something I was going to say, but it slipped my mind. See? Yeah. Humanness, you know, we're all just showing. Oh, I know what it was. It was like, you know, I think about like a lot of the teachers and a lot of people I've really looked up to. And I come back to this quote I heard from a teacher when I was at a residency for grad school. And they're like, don't, what was it? Don't not shine your light to make others feel uncomfortable, or to make others feel comfortable. So, and then I think about that of like all the teachers that I really looked up to, you know, like what if like Stan didn't write some of these books, or what if like so-and-so didn't do this or didn't do that and like step into their role? Like where the hell would I be? And then like I think about like some of my gifts, and I'm, you know, we're our own worst critic, right? Like we're going to criticize our stuff the worst. And then I'm like, I'm not good enough for this, or I'm not going to do this. And then I always think about like the people that like I really look up to, and I'm sure they've experienced too. And that's why I kind of like to hear some of people's backstories, to see what some of those struggles were. But just to even think about, what if they didn't show up for their life's work? And what if you don't show up for your life's work? And how that could really impact somebody, you know, doesn't need to be 1 million plus people, even just one person. I mean, there's a lot of people that I really respect, like even my teachers, you know, they've touched like a bunch of people's lives, but not on the scale of Instagram influencers and this and that. But, you know, it's like just to not show up and shine your light and to really dive into your soul's work. I think it's almost like yeah.
What if you don't show up for your life's work? That is I think, a perfect invitation to leave everybody with today. And Kyle, I just want to thank you. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Amazing to have you here recording this
thanks for the invite.
In Brooklyn, in my apartment. And how can people connect with you on Instagram and Facebook?
Sure. If you want to follow Psychedelics Today, psychedelicstoday.com, Psychedelics Today on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And that's a joint venture. So that's me, Joe, and then our other team member, Marissa. If you want to follow more of my personal stuff, that's over at settingsunwellness.com, and then Setting Sun Wellness on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
And you have the Psychedelics Today podcast as well.
Psychedelics Today podcast as well.
Correct. Yep. Amazing. Thank you so much for being on the Thought Room today, and we'll have you back soon.
Yeah, thanks so much.